Hello, everybody. Oh, I can't quite see everybody here. Hello. How are you? Did you enjoy the film? Yes, very good. Excellent. Well, obviously, I've got Melanie here, who is a super fab expert in Muriel Box, and I'm going to ask her a couple of questions about the film, just coming out of the film. And then I'm going to invite you to ask some questions or to make some comments about the film, and we'll have hopefully, by the end of it, we'll have a kind of conversation between us all. So I'm just going to start off with a really sort of straightforward question. You gave us some really good information about Muriel Box in the introduction, and obviously she's a really interesting figure. She is, apart from Dorothy Arsner, I think the earliest woman in the season of Women Can't Make Comedy, Women Aren't Funny, whatever it's called.
Women aren't funny.
Demonstrated, of course, that women are funny, and as you say, she's quite prolific in British cinema, and she's one of only two women making feature. Three.
Yeah. I mean, you can count them on one hand. And she's by far the most prolific. Can you say what you think it is about her character, perhaps, that enables her to be the most prolific woman filmmaker in a period where really there are so few? Yeah. Well, I think it's partly character. She's very dedicated to the idea of directing, and is willing to pursue that when there are lots of obstacles, things preventing her from doing that. But she's certainly not alone in that. So there are lots of other women who kind of get to do little bits of stuff, particularly during wartime, short work, non-commercial stuff, but are blockaded from being able to develop a career. Muriel Box is very fortunate in that she has a kind of system set up, in that she's working in collaboration with her husband, Sidney Box. And because of that, and his lack of prejudice about the fact that women are perfectly capable of directing, means that there is a kind of way of enabling her to direct films. So I think in some ways that it's got a lot to do with her desire and ambition, and she talks about when she first makes a short documentary film during wartime for their company Verity. She directs, and she's like, it was like a duck to water. I just thought, this is what I'm meant to do. But she's certainly not alone in that, and I think there's a kind of legions of other women who don't get to do that, but she does. And also I think she makes hay, while she has the opportunity. She is willing to kind of pursue that and has the framework to do it. And that is what means that, depressingly, she's still the woman mainstream director in British film with the greatest number of credits. And I've had to check that several times because it seems so preposterous that someone like Muriel Box is still in that position, but she is. I've looked at all the potential competitors and no one's quite come close yet. I mean, they will, hopefully. But her and the two that are often talked about in the 1950s, both working in comedy quite a lot, both women directors in British film, Wendy Toy and Muriel Box. And I think it's really interesting that both of them are drawn to comedy as a way of, telling the kinds of stories that they are interested in, because it does seem to grant them certain kinds of license to kind of make fun of conventions and expectations, particularly around gender roles. That Box talks about it as like sugaring the pill. Sometimes you kind of need to soften the point a bit, and comedy is one really powerful vehicle for that.
And I guess obviously we've just seen The Passionate Stranger, and one of the things that's really interesting about it is the way that it does play with genre. And obviously Box worked in a lot of, she worked in comedy, but she also dealt with sort of, she worked across a series of popular genres. And I suppose, one thing about The Passionate Stranger is that, clearly, essentially it's about writing and about writing fiction and about generic conventions of different kinds of fictions that you might want to write. Do you want to talk a little bit about that in terms of both the film itself and in terms of Box and the way in which she sort of crosses different generic categories and writing categories in her career?
Yeah, I mean it's a really interesting example of a kind of meta film or a kind of story within a story, and it's very interesting to compare it or kind of place it in a double bill with the previous film she made, Simon and Laura, which is about a couple who are actors who are married, who don't really get on, and then they're offered a kind of reality TV show appearing as themselves as this perfectly happy couple. So you get this juxtaposition of, you know, actually the fact that they hate each other and the roles that they have to perform in order to, you know, meet the requirements of this television series that they're appearing in. And I think it makes quite an interesting pairing with The Passionate Stranger. A kind of different format, but still that idea of the kind of chasm between how things should be or could be, or how they might be romanticised as being, and a kind of more prosaic reality, which, you know, doesn't live up to those kinds of dream worlds that people create. So it's kind of, I think it's an interesting thing for her to do, and I think it does also hark back to that big breakthrough success that they had with The Seventh Veil, which does a lot of the things that we see in that film being kind of, but done absolutely seriously. So the kind of, you know, passionately committed female pianist who's, you know, passionately engaged in her work is done straight in The Seventh Veil with Anne Todd. And here we kind of see it being replayed almost for kind of laughs and exaggeration. So I think that the Boxes are kind of referring back to their earlier career a bit.
It's very much about their own career, definitely, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that whole, I suppose it's about that whole 40s genre of sort of games for melodrama, same sort of thing, you know, that like the subtlety of the differences between the reality that you see at the beginning and then when it becomes the fictional version, you know, like the maid's got a bit of lipstick and is a little bit more sassy, and and she goes from being a novelist to being a concert pianist. That's quite a subtle difference, but it's enough to make it really overblown and bonkers.
I mean, I think thinking about it in technical terms and in terms of production design, it's a really interesting film because there were certain technical challenges in getting the black and white and the colour footage to kind of work together, but also the kind of subtleties in switching up the production design. So when we see the pub in reality, it's not this kind of bucolic English inn, it's got like a pinball table, and so we're kind of seeing the same set, but George Provis, the art director, is like dressing it in a slightly different way, and the home that they live in when we first see Mario going for his job interview, it's been dressed in a different way to make it more lavish, and obviously the costuming as well. So even though Margaret Leighton is wearing these kind of new look sticky out dresses, they become so much more kind of exaggerated when she's in the colour section of the film. They're kind of ridiculously lavish and glamorous.
Who do you think the film is sending up?
I'm not sure, because one of the things that I think the critics weren't so sure about is that it didn't seem to be really burlesquing romantic fiction. It doesn't really go for the jugular. It could have kind of exaggerated it and sent it up so much more, and it doesn't.
It could have been nasty about romance, and it's not really nasty about romance, is it?
And that, in some ways, the fact that the differences aren't as massive as they could have been, and the kind of novel within the film isn't really over the top, seemed to be a bit of a sticking point for some critics. They kind of thought, well, what is it that this film is doing? Oh, I ought to say as well, the two things that they changed at quite a late stage. One was that originally Carlo Giustini's character was not going to be Italian. It was going to be French. It's going to be Pierre instead, the French chauffeur, which I think would kind of be a whole other set of kind of semiotics around the kind of, foreign lover. And Muriel Box writes in her diary about sort of auditioning all these hunky Frenchmen and sort of trying to work out which one to cast in it. But it doesn't work out, so they kind of make the switch to him being Italian. So interesting, I think, kind of different things that come with those kind of cliches of national identity. The other thing was that at the end, his wife was going to turn up. So it was going to be revealed that he was married and his wife was going to turn up and kind of give him bollocking and take him off home. Whereas they decide not to do that and have something a bit more kind of sweet and romantically hopeful, that actually, the maid and the chauffeur who were on the bus together, like the end of The Graduate, maybe they'll get together. So it kind of leaves you with a bit more hope, whereas originally it was a bit more kind of nasty, I guess, that, all along he was this kind of cliched, kind of romancer, womanizer.
One of the things that the reviews also sort of talk a little bit about, or kind of notice, I guess, is that quite a few of them mentioned that the story has a relationship to Lady Chatterley's lover. What's going on there? Because, as far as I know, Lady Chatterley's lover wasn't available.
No, it's available, but not, readily available. Yes, that is interesting, isn't it?
It's
thinking
sort of like
about, where it comes before the kind of ending of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP, to quote Philip Larkin. I think what it's doing more broadly is kind of making fun of certain kinds of like kind of romantic fiction. Not that fits D.H. Lawrence necessarily, but it's a bit like Cold Comfort Farm's tactic, of taking these kind of overall melodramas and kind of unpicking them and sort of underplaying the high feelings, well, just grow up, be a bit more sensible, go and have a wash, sort yourself out, and it will all be fine. It's got that kind of sensible English undercutting of anything too kind of florid or kind of melodramatic, and
I guess there's a sense in which, on some level, it's a very 50s film in that respect, isn't it? It's like, understand the conventions of fiction, but also understand that conventions of fiction are conventions. You can't imagine it working in a sort of like post, 60s new wave context, because there it's much more about authenticity and whereas this is all about the sort of conventions of 1950s fiction making, and sort of slightly playing those up and making it clear that you don't really believe in those conventions, but those conventions still have to be in place for you to understand what the film's doing, sort of thing.
Yeah, the closest thing I can think of is a film from a couple of years later, which is called Please Turn Over, which is about somebody who writes a kind of, quite saucy book, kind of Peyton Place style book about this English village, and then everybody's trying to work out who's who and where the inspiration came from. So there was something metafictional in the air. But I think the bit where in the kind of later section of the film where he goes to the British Legion and they're sort of jiving to trad jazz, it's suddenly like, which doesn't sound terribly modern, but it's this kind of moment of like, oh, we're in the 1950s, this is
yes, and this doesn't work for this fantasy that he's having about what the romance might be.
It's not many films where you see Morris dancing eroticized, but this is one of them.
Okay, now, does anybody in the audience have any thoughts or questions about The Passionate Stranger? On the end of the line here, just here. Go ahead.
Hi, you'll have to forgive me because I actually missed the beginning of it. But one thing, I'm really sorry. That's not allowed in this cinema. But, so I don't know how I managed to get in. But one thing I was going to say is one thing that occurred to me was that Carlo's reading of the script is sort of somehow playing along with the sending up the idea of a woman romanticizing reading a woman's romance book. But that's probably stating the obvious, that I like the kind of change in the fact that that's happening, the man's doing it and over romanticizing it. So that was my thinking.
Yes, I think that's the mark of Muriel.
You might have already said that. So
no, but I think you're absolutely right. It is so interesting to see, because so often women are positioned as the kind of dupes, gullible, enthralled to this ridiculous romance. And of course, in this film, it's the man who reads the thing and thinks, this is how reality could be. And that kind of gender switch, I think, is really interesting. You watch something like The Love Lottery, which is from around the same time, and it's absolutely, the women are the ones who are absolutely have their heads in the clouds, are full of this kind of romantic nonsense, which is so much part of the discourses of romantic fiction and Mills and Boon and all of that. And I think this does do an interesting flip, where the guy is the one who's bowled over and enthralled to it, and the woman is like, no, that's the book. That's not reality. No, that's the book again.
I guess there's also a couple of other things about it. I mean, one is that he's foreign, and the other is that he's a servant in a house that's middle class. I love the bit at the beginning where she's like, it's about people like us, darling.
Yeah.
And that sort of, so there's a sort of class and I guess kind of Englishness element to the whole. Actually, we're really practical, or like nobody's going to be falling in love around here.
Yes.
You need to forget about that concept sort of idea.
Well, it's got a kind of interesting link to something like Brief Encounter, I think, where you have the same, downplaying of, anything aspirational, and then obviously Celia Johnson is bursting with all these feelings that, Trevor Howard just has to light the blue touch paper and... Yeah, and off it goes. But the kind of film within a film in that, even though it's much briefer and is only a trailer, so that which is it? What's it? Flames of Passion. Flames of Passion. Yeah. Yes. So more passion, and the juxtaposition between reality and romantic fiction being consumed by men and women is played up in that film as well. But yeah, that idea of kind of sensible downplaying of any nonsense like that, and the insistence on seeing Ralph Richardson's character as this kind of wounded, tragic, and then no, we've got 2 kids, they're just off at boarding school. It's kind of refusing that kind of exaggerated, kind of extreme version. So it's kind of anti-Laurentian, I think, in the same way as something like Cold Comfort Farm is undercutting and making fun of that.
Yeah. Do you have another? Go ahead, Tal.
I kind of on that. I felt that there was even more, rather than kind of emphasizing that, like, oh, we won't be kind of tempted away or anything like that. There was almost a sense of like, there's no touch paper to be lit, actually, and it's not necessarily the case that she won't be tempted away from her husband and family. It's that actually she's got quite a kind of decent and sort of positive support network around her, and her husband's kind of a good guy, and they have kids, and like her publishers are, supportive, and I found that kind of quite subversive in a way, and that the color sections then became kind of almost highlighting that romantic fantasy is actually basically quite empty, and actually there's kind of more color to be found in a life built, and a family that's grown. And so it's almost the color is in those black and white sections, and then at the end, as much as it's a kind of nice kind of happy ending at the end, there's almost the subversion of the kind of romance trope that class contradiction kind of breeds lust. It's like, actually, no, like you're more likely to,
cop off with somebody.
Yeah, basically,
in the back of a bus.
Yeah. And So yeah, I mean, you talked about sugaring the pill. I'm just wondering, because I did think, without being kind of savage, it was quite a kind of deconstruction of a lot of those myths, and actually being a celebration maybe of the banal, you know. So I'm just wondering how it was kind of sold at the time, and how it played. Like, was it sold as more racy maybe than it actually is, because of, you know, it's sending up a popular genre at the time?
There's some really interesting discrepancies in the marketing of the film. So some of the posters present it as this kind of straightforward romance of the story within the story. So there's lots of, you know, Margaret lightning clinches with Carlo Giustini. And then the other tactic is to do what you do for all comedy films in British cinema around this time, which is to have giant heads on tiny funny little bodies, and jaunty writing. So it's like they weren't quite sure what aspect of the film to go with. I think in that companionate marriage as well, I think you, without wanting to get too biographical, I think you get a glimpse of the Boxes as well. A kind of, you know, reflection of their own partnership at that time. You know, doesn't carry on in that vein for indefinitely, but at that point I think it kind of gives a sense of this alternative. And it's interesting that in the romantic fiction he's much more of a tyrant, this kind of patriarch forbidding her from doing things, and in the reality it's like, oh, you can do that if you like. It's much more kind of equal and easygoing, and much less punitive and dramatic. So it seems to be saying something about the seedbed for certain kinds of romance. And again, kind of thinking back to The Seventh Veil and the kind of really exaggerated kind of, you know, male domination stuff going on in that, which people like, you know, it's like catnip. It's fantastic stuff. But, you know, you get a very different vision of romance and the relationship between the sexes in this film.
For those of you who haven't seen The Seventh Veil, has anybody not seen The Seventh Veil? A few of you. There's a brilliant scene where, I mean, it's all about her wanting to play the piano and him teaching Ash to play the piano, and then suddenly deciding he doesn't want her to play, and he beats her
while she's
fingers.
playing the piano, he hits her fingers with his
brutal.
walking cane. Oh gosh, yes. It's,
as opposed to this, where it's like, clearly they are a professional couple, they're both happy working, and I guess there's a sense in which, like you're saying, the Boxes were also, I mean, I suppose they were like an emblematic professional couple, weren't they? They both were, I mean, they worked together, but they also both worked separately in the film industry in this very, like, you know, they are a working couple kind of way. Yes,
yeah. I mean, I think, and there's the kind of bigger network of Boxes as well. So you've got Sydney, producer, writer, married to Muriel, writer, director. Sydney's sister is Betty Box, who produced lots and lots of really successful British films. And then she's married to Peter Rogers, but also makes lots of films with Ralph Thomas, who is the brother of Gerald Thomas, who directs The Carry-On. So there's a real kind of tightly knit network of people making British comedies around this time, and yeah, that Muriel is part of that. And
there's no Michael Powell nonsense about being artistes. Like, they are commercial, full-on, successful commercial films. So, like, there's no messing around with the whole idea that, you know, they had to do stuff. Like, they do commercial stuff, and they will change their films to make them commercial, and that's what they're interested in.
Yes, although I think Muriel is a bit... She has kind of aspirations to kind of do other things, and she's very keen to address what she talks about as the woman question in her works. And she, in her diary, talks about, you know, I think Sydney's a bit, you know, I wonder if he gets a bit fed up with me always wanting to talk about this, but this is important to me, and, you know, it is. So, you know, she is very clear, both subsequently but also at the time, that she is a feminist. And the work that she is making is, you know, feminist in its aspirations. And of course, this is a point where we're kind of pre the feminine mystique, before the kind of, you know, revitalization of feminism in its second wave. So Rachel Cook is very interesting on this, placing both Box women, Betty and Muriel, in a collection of women who were building careers in the 50s across a range of different professions, and that begins to see them less as outliers and more as something that was, you know, an important component of the 50s. It wasn't all back to the kitchen. It was, you know, much more complex than that. And Muriel is a good example of that.
Christine, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And part of it, I think, is that there is still just about a studio system producing British cinema in the 50s, which sort of collapses, really, pretty soon after that. So while clearly there's a lot going for Muriel Box in terms of her own personality and relationships, etc., once she's got going, there is a structure that can enable her to make 12 films or whatever it is. So I'm also... I want to argue the other way around this fictional stuff, because it seemed to me that, this is obviously because I'm a sucker for melodrama, but I think one way of looking at it is actually that the colour film tells the truth.
That's what she really wants.
Exactly.
Yes.
I mean, here's this woman, you know, in this lovely house, lovely husband, except he's in a wheelchair, blah, blah, blah. But what she really needs is this wonderful, passionate knight in her best nightdress. I love the clothes she carries around. You know, standing around in the roses, waiting for him to turn up. It's not accidental. And also the truth about her husband, who is nasty and not necessarily supportive of her. Now, this is a possible truth, which the black and white stuff is busy covering up with all this nice middle class, you know, companion at marriage stuff. So it seems to me, at the very least, it's a wonderful demonstration of why all those Gainsborough melodramas were so popular, and why in The Wicked Lady, my favourite line in the whole of British cinema, she says, "The only thing that stands between me and my heart's desire is my husband."
I think we've all felt that.
You know, it can read either way, which might be the cleverness, I think, of it. Really, there's enough going on in the melodrama to make it, you know, interesting and worthwhile and speak to you, kind of thing. It's not played for comedy, actually.
No, it's played quite straight.
And the final thing about it, I think, is the ending, which I think is really bizarre. You know, we think that he might be dead, even though he's managed to escape the wheelchair trap that the chauffeurs set up for him, and instead got the child, which is quite nice. She opens the door and goes, you know, well, I thought, you know, maybe he's lying down dead there. But of course not. He's struggling on this thing to walk so that he too could be the perfect husband, who is actually potent after all, you know. I just think that's a weird ending. It's weirder than quite a lot of the melodramas manage. And so that it indicates to me that there's something going on in that black and white bit that isn't so comfortable and nice and, you know, sorted as it would like to be saying.
I think you're right. I mean, I think in that final goodbye between them, it's ostensibly because he saved her child, but there's a kind of, you know, frisson. So is the novel writing the kind of, it genuinely, he reads it correctly, it is a kind of frustrated daydream that, you know, can't come true, but is what's more real, the colour or the black and white? I'm not so sure.
You see, I think we can divide all British cinema fans between those who think that Celia Johnson should have gone off with Trevor Howard and those who are very pleased that she stayed with Cyril Raymond. We got somebody right at the back there. Go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of observations. Yeah, you mentioned Police Turnover, which is also Joel Thomas and Peter Rogers, of course, but in that full carry-on mode then. The other thing is, I was thinking maybe you could probably do quite good day school or something about films in which servants read romance novels, because it's quite a feature of The Remains of the Day that Anthony Hopkins does, and also the valet, who's John Gielgud or Derek Jacobi, version in Murder on the Orient Express, reads romance novels to kind of make sure his English is pure and everything. Yes. But that wasn't what I was going to say. I was going to say, Yeah, I disagree. I think the black and white version is the good version. Is because one thing's at the end.
Do you
she's
think
really
she should have
excited.
stayed with Cyril Raymond in Brief Encounter, Nikki?
Well, of course. But she has just discovered that basically Ralph Richards going to be able to have sex again. She's so woke. But I was going to ask about the Italian guy, Carlos Giustini, because Wikipedia has told me two things about him. One, that he spoke perfect English, and the other is that he's dubbed in this.
Yes.
So, tell me. And did they make it Italian because they thought they were going to be able to get Rossano Brazzi? Because
I think there's a kind of Rossano Brazzi meta text going on in that, you know, this is the kind of height of his popularity as the kind of Italian lover in Summer Madness, Three Coins in the Fountain, you know, a whole set of films. So that idea of the crinkly haired, gorgeous Latin lover is quite current. So the film is definitely playing on that. The thing about servants reading things, of course, that's the famous thing in the Chatterley trial, isn't it? You know, would you want your servant to read this? So that it's kind of anticipating that whole absolutely disastrous attempt to ban or to keep that story under wraps. The idea of the servants reading things and misinterpreting them. That is kind of what happens in this film.
Absolutely,
So.
this is Lady Chatterley.
Yeah,
as
before
feared
the
by
fact.
judges.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, sorry about that. Do you think she was actually trying to make a comment about race and class, or do you think she was just using those as like contextually appropriate devices, you know, with all the jokes about the foreigners and the ending with, you know, the servants finding each other and maybe finding the right level?
I think it's kind of poking fun at some of those assumptions, and even the kind of interchangeability of, you know, we're going to make him French, no, we're going to make him Italian. It's suggesting something about how those identities are kind of lumped in together as continentals, you know, who are automatically more passionate than anyone in England. I suppose it does also kind of play into those as well. You know, there's no denying it. It kind of does those. The press for Carlo Giustini is like, girls are going to love him. He's gorgeous. He can, you know, he's set for a really illustrious career in films.
Does he have one?
No. And he is dubbed by another actor. So in post production, they found that it kind of wasn't working at all. So someone else, Robert Rietti, dubbed all his lines, did a really fantastic job. So it's, you know, it's a really good. No, you can't see the join, as they say. But you know, another of those technical challenges, I think, that the film faced and did well with. I mean, lots of critics kind of think it's an interesting conceit, but it's not. It doesn't quite come off, or it kind of drags a bit. But I don't know whether they're just a bit intolerant, really.
Yeah, critics are, you know, full of nonsense. Oh, we've got. Well, let's have two more. Oh.
Well, I was just wondering, I've never heard about Muriel Box before, and I don't know about her biographical aspirations and at that time, but I'm wondering if it's not a little bit of an overinterpretation that she wanted to deconstruct the genres, really. I was actually struck by the juxtaposition between the two parts. I was expecting it to be more comedic, like the middle part all of a sudden becomes a little bit cringy. Even, you know, like, and you feel like, oh, now it's not so tense and it's so serious all of a sudden, and there's no joke anymore, you know. And so I was like, maybe she wanted to serve both genres in one movie. Maybe that was also part of it, because of course, you know, from today's perspective, I guess, it looks very like ironical, or even like, yeah, a little bit. She's making fun of conventions, but that's an easy thing to say from our perspective. But I'm just wondering, like, with your background knowledge of what she was willing up to, does this assumption hold?
I think one thing that comes across through a lot of her work, and she worked in films, but she also wrote plays as well, and later on wrote novels as well, is that she is very interested in kind of holding things up to the light and kind of, playing with expectations and conventions, particularly around gender, but not only around that. And so I think this film is kind of part of that continuation of kind of questing, kind of always worrying away at particular things, not necessarily kind of taking them as read. And the film that she makes afterwards is called The Truth About Women, which is all based on a kind of man's perspective of the different women that he's known in his life. And then I found in her diary she's working on a sequel called The Truth About Men. But I can find nothing else about it. There's no draft script material. She doesn't really talk about what the content of that might be. But that idea of the truth about, so really trying to get at some underlying enigma or puzzle or kind of suppressed truth, and that quest being very much illuminated by her feminism. So wanting to kind of ask questions about the way that men and women relate to each other, but also the expectations they have of the kinds of lives that they might lead.
The interesting thing to me seems that she does that in this commercial context. If you look at the new wave later, they break out of that. They come from a completely different direction and all of a sudden find themselves successful against all odds in a way. But that she pulls this off in the studio system. Maybe it's also because she didn't have anything else to work with. So, but yeah, it's quite an interesting way to try to play with conventions and still be successful.
Well, I think she's sort of. I mean, one of the things that's really clear about her, I think, in her early work before she starts making films, she's a really, she's a script writer and she writes scripts. She doesn't write scripts expecting them to be hits. She writes scripts for amateur theatre shows to put on. She writes scripts and scripts and scripts and scripts. What I mean is she just writes a lot. She really understands those conventions. It's not like she's sort of playing with them without really, really understanding what's going on.
And she's an absolute workaholic. She's always got a project on the go, and she accuses Sydney of being a workaholic, which he is. But she's just as bad. There's always some kind of writing project on the go, and when there isn't a writing project on the go, she's a kind of gardener. So she's always got some kind of project that she's working on. She's that kind of person. Of the great unmade Muriel Box films, one other one that is interesting is she writes a novel called The Big Switch, which she's trying to make into a film in the 60s and wants Ken Adam to do the production design. But it's about it's a kind of post-apocalyptic story. After a nuclear war, women take over and become the leaders, and men are the subordinate sex, a bit like The Worm That Turned, the two Ronnie series. But this guy has been in a coma, and they uncover him, wake him up, and then he's in this new world where women are in charge and is trying to navigate it, which I think would have been a fantastic film. But I can see also how it doesn't slot into what's going on in 60s British cinema at all. So the Sleeper Wakes,
is different.
Yeah.
I had a little question, but I think it's half covered by you now. How was her feminism was manifesting in her career? So you talked a little bit about the big switch, obviously, and you talked about the woman question. How did you put it before? So
that's what that's how she describes it in her diary. She talks about, I'm always on at the woman question. This idea of what women's role in society should be, what the fact that they haven't gained equality, and obviously that's interlaced with her own career, but also her own marriage, which is not a kind of carefree one. It's kind of increasingly troubled. And I think one of the things I got from looking at her diaries is this sense of kind of the intensities and the kind of internal battles in this marriage, and that she reflects upon in really interesting ways. I think her diaries are so rich and fascinating and very revealing, probably in ways that means that they can never be published. But they've really given me whole new ways of thinking about her films. In some ways, the films that we get are kind of like the tip of an iceberg that is, much bigger in terms of her critical thinking about gender, about femininity, about herself, about her relation to other people. So she's a deep thinker, is Muriel.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, I was thinking that in the colour part, it's not just that he's this sort of attractive Spanish man, but the thing that for me that where she suddenly gets attracted to him on a deeper level is when he reveals that he understands music. Mm. And I think that is an important point, that it, again, she's saying it's not just, but oh my goodness, yes, I think you should have kept the tempo a bit. I love that. I love that was, that enhanced any other things. And I think a lot of women want that. They want that combination of somebody who's exciting, but also they can meet them on a creative or intellectual level as well. So that's just something that struck me.
And note, the husband in the black and white bit doesn't read her novel.
No.
If he did,
he'd have known what was going on. Yes, absolutely. And it becomes a running joke that he doesn't read her books. Yeah. But it's also a little criticism, isn't it? It's like you shouldn't have played it like that. It's like what pickup artists refer to as negging, isn't it? You know, if you want to really attract a woman and draw her in, you criticise her, and that will interest her. So he kind of does a bit of that. He is suggesting that he understands the music more than she does, and she responds to that. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay, I guess we've got one more question there, and then let's can we wrap? We'll wrap it up after that, I guess.
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned the idea of who is this kind of targeted at, and I'm wondering whether it's kind of targeted at consumers of romantic melodrama, and it kind of goes back to the debate about the color section versus the black and white and what's kind of the truth. Because to me, it was kind of the more romantic, melodramatic stuff was kind of shown to be slightly ludicrous. In the colour section, you wait on the rose balcony and she'll eventually arrive and she'll fall into your arms. Whereas if you actually try and climb up the trellis, it's going to fall down. Yeah, the dog's going to come. And even the piano things, of course, your chauffeur out of nowhere is also a music expert who understands the piece that you're working on. And I think there's even a sense that the husband doesn't need to read the manuscripts because she doesn't need to sort of justify what she's doing to him. And to go back to the discussion about the shot when they say goodbye and the idea that this shows actually no, she is sort of yearning for him. I think that's kind of a key shot in where they say goodbye and she walks away and she's sort of shot from behind walking away, and the camera is waiting for her to turn around and sort of give him one final look, and you find yourself as the audience waiting for her to turn around and sort of reveal actually, but she doesn't. She just keeps walking, goes into the workshop and finds out that the husband's got a nice surprise for her. Yeah. So I think I don't know if you kind of feel that there is a kind of, maybe the target of all of that is the audience itself, and it's making you fall into the trap of becoming the sort of melodrama romantic audience member, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think in practical terms as well, who is this speaking to? Who is it for? Because in some ways the ideal audience for it is not going to the cinema as much as it used to. So there's a sense that this film is slightly out of time, maybe. It's the same year as The Girl Can't Help It, you know. We're into 1957, rock and roll has happened, things are changing. And although this film is kind of pursuing quite an interesting puzzle, I think, in its structure, there's maybe a sense that we've moved on. And, you know, famously, the Rattigan play that Sheila Delaney saw and thought, I can do better than that, I'm going to write A Taste of Honey, has Margaret Leighton in. So there is this sense that, you know, perhaps Leighton's more part of the old guard, although she goes on to give many brilliant performances.
It's
you know,
interesting, isn't it? It's like, on the one hand, you can read it like that this is a sort of film out of its time, and like there's a new realism coming. On the other hand, it's also a debate about the realism versus melodrama that had been happening from the 40s, you know, from the 1945 through until this moment. This idea of, you know, that somehow British cinema's true business is realism, and that is, you know, that is being sort of, and it's like you repress emotion, you're anti-melodramatic, you know, but also British cinema sort of, you know, underbelly is the Gainsborough melodrama and The Wicked Lady, and etc.
And of course, Sydney and Muriel Box take charge of Gainsborough,
and they straddle both of those things. They make
they're put in charge of the studio,
Yes.
and then they start making films that maybe aren't those costume melodramas quite so much.
But also they start by making The Seventh Veil, and also like there's Betty making the Here Come the Hoggets.
Yes.
Like they are doing both of those versions of British cinema throughout.
Yes, they bestride British cinema like a glorious
Titans.
colossus.
And on that note, thank you very much, Melanie.
Thank you, Lawrence.